While Ukraine continued to strike the Russian ammunition warehouses very hard, the significant damage today was caused to the very important and very big ammunition storage in Tikhoretsk, Krasnodar Oblast. And let's zoom into the place to check out the facility. So this is the Tikhoretsk city. It has the airfield and also it has the ammunition storage. The storage, as you may see, is kind of the big one. Well, not as big as the previous Russian ammunition facility, which Ukraine struck really hard. That facility was at least 3 times larger. But what's important about this one, that Russia stored there the North Korean artillery shells. And the strike happened exactly at the moment that the Russians were offloading their shells to the facility. We have this information from the Russian Z channels, they confirm it. Some of the eyewitnesses filmed the huge kaboom of the facility. So here you can see the distance fire, but what happened after a couple of seconds? A huge kaboom. Guys, you may watch this video fully on my Telegram channel. Unfortunately, because of the YouTube restrictions, I cannot show you the full video of this kaboom, but it was really big. I would say even bigger compared to the previous one, because the car probably was more closer to this kaboom and it was spectacular. Ukraine hit Russia really hard right into the heart of the Russian army. Artillery shells, rockets, Russian munition, Russian resources, which they crucially need to continue the war in Ukraine. So it's a new step, as you may see, in this escalation. Before Ukraine hit many of the Russian oil refinery facilities and oil storages, it disturbed the logistics for the Russian army, but not that significantly compared to ammunition. I believe it will play a great role, especially if Ukraine hit the nearby ammunition warehouses, which Russia uses constantly to supply weaponry to Ukraine. And I believe that those measures, those sanctions against the Russian munition, may slow down the Russian army advancement on the eastern side of Ukraine, also including Pokrovsk direction. Hello my friends and welcome, my name is Dennis and this is the latest update from Ukraine. Let's go. And we have this interesting fire image showing that there is also the fire on the Russian military base, the military airfield, the ammunition depot, and also there's the fire in the local settlements because the shells now from this ammunition depot are flying around and will fly for the next couple of days. My friends, if you like the job that I do on YouTube, you may consider joining me on Patreon. I'll put the link for my Patreon page right in the video description below. Thank you so much for maintaining my motivation, especially when I have troubles with the YouTube monetization. And here's one more big kaboom that was detected during the daytime already, and there are lots of the munitions, so it will continue to kaboom for a very long time. What is also interesting, Ukraine hit the Russian military base in Krasnodar region as well, and before that base belonged to the Wagner group, so the Wagner army. Later on, Wagner group officially transferred the facility to the Russian Defense Ministry. Locals report about the barracks burning and they are not sure whether this was caused by Ukrainian drones or not. And here are some more satellite images, the plain one and infrared. One more Russian ammunition storage caught fire in Oktobersky, it's the Tver region. Definitely we have the confirmation from the NASA satellite images. The Oktobersky ammunition depot is located not far away from the Toropets ammunition warehouse, which previously was kaputted by Ukrainian drones. So for the last week, Russia lost 3 of the biggest ammunition depots. I wonder how they may continue the fight after it, I mean assault operations. Well, still Russia has more storages, but they may lose those which are not far away from Ukrainian borders. And I would say that this spot is quite far away, it's around 700 kilometers from Kiev. So what Ukraine wants to do with those strikes, I believe that the Ukrainian government wants to show our Western allies and first of all to the United States of America, to the White House administration, that there are no longer red lines for Russia, that Ukraine can, may and should have the permission to use the Western-made long-range missiles, cruise missiles and ATACMS to hit Russian facilities. If Ukraine is so successful with the drones, just imagine for Ukraine to obtain that permission. Well, the range of the cruise missiles and ATACMS is quite limited compared to those long-range drones, but the devastation power of ATACMS is outstanding. You sometimes also ask me, Dennis, what's about the Kerch Bridge, why Ukraine is not hitting the Kerch Bridge? I believe our allies also put the ban on it, because they're afraid of the major escalation from the Russian side. That's why there is the supply line towards Crimea, but in the future Ukraine will get rid of it under the current White House administration or the next one, but we'll see that move for sure. I'll touch the United States politics just a little here nuclear, so if Trump gets the power, there is definitely the risk for Ukraine to obtain less munition, but at the same time, if Ukraine doesn't get that help, Ukraine is free to use all of the weaponry it has against any kind of the Russian infrastructure object. Biden's administration has the influence on Ukraine because the United States of America supply munition, weaponry, but if there are no supplies any longer, Ukraine is free to act on its will. Yeah, in general, if there are no supplies, it's very bad, but you may find some good news from it as well. Alright, it has never been before, but it happened again. The Russian nuclear missile test failed. We have the satellite image showing the big crater or the hole in the ground which was left by the Russian nuclear missile. Yeah, the warhead itself didn't explode because for that you need the internal detonation of the warhead. So if you shut down the nuclear missile, it will not explode into nuclear explosion. However, the missile itself kaboomed, causing those kind of the damages. And this is the Russian test site for the Russian Sarmat missile. Putin always threatens the world and especially Western countries that his Sarmat missile is state-of-art, it may go to any point, you're unable to detect it, it's the best ICBM out there, but it's not the first time that Russia failed with those tests, particularly with Sarmat missile. The Sarmat missile is also called RS-28, and to be honest, there were some of the successful tests, but it's like 50-50. Also, it has the alternate name SSX-30 Satan II. Yeah, so-called Christian Orthodox country calls its missiles Satans. The range of the missile is potentially 18,000 kilometers. It's around half of the globe, which this missile might cover. Russia took this missile officially into the army in 2023, but still they conduct the tests. It's like with Sukhoi 57. On the paper, that aircraft in the Russian army, but they do not use it. And here we have the confirmation from the NASA fire satellites that definitely something crashed there, and yes, it was the Russian ICBM Sarmat. So then Russia says that they will launch nukes against their enemies on the west. Well, actually they showed that they could partially launch those missiles on their own territory. Alright guys, now to the military map update. As you can see, the situation for Ukrainian army in Kursk is not that great, at least according to the Institute for the Study of War, and they published the claimed territory. So if Russia claimed that they've took this under control, they immediately covered this place in amber or red, but here we may see that Russia starts their attacks on different parts on the Ukrainian controlled territory in Kursk. Also, Russia tries to counterattack Ukrainian forces. Here they claim that they've took the ground and separated the Ukrainian army in two and already reached the Ukrainian border, but we don't have this confirmation from the other sources. What I might tell you that Ukraine reached probably its maximum in Kursk already, because to conquer the Russian counteroffensive you need lots and lots of the resources, at least 3 times more than Ukraine currently has. And there is the huge question in this case whether Ukraine will be able to encircle the Russian group between the Seine River and the Ukrainian border. As for me, this task is unrealistic for now, let's be honest. After all, it all comes down to the resources and supply lines. Well, if Ukraine will use the combination of ATACMS, cruise missiles, drones, I think Ukraine has the chances to disturb gradually the Russian logistics, the Russian ammunition, so Russians will not be successful there in this case. The problem is that it's not the only front line for Ukraine. I think that Ukraine should focus also more on the eastern side of Ukraine. And if there are no changes with the United States policy, well, my prediction in that case that Ukraine will withdraw the forces during the cold period of the year or during even the rainy season in October, November, December, because it would be just hard to provide our guys with supplies. And yes, with this Ukrainian assault operation, it was done very brilliantly. I mean, the idea. It was also the smart move to cut the bridges, but Russians were able to restore the supplies using the pontoon bridges, many of those been hit, but they continued to put them again and again. So the idea was brilliant, but execution, well, simply not enough resources. And I'm not one of those pro-Ukrainian influencers who always scream that, okay, Ukraine is winning. No, guys, I provide you with the real information, the truthful one, and if there is not a good story, I will not over-exaggerate it, I'll tell you as it is. Yes, sometimes I use encouraging thumbnails, yes, as usual, and I always speak about the good news at first, but we need to see the real picture after all. Well, the good thing that Ukraine still keeps the vast territories of Kursk, including the Sudzha town, which Ukraine was able to take, but with the current Russian pressure and with the current Ukrainian resources, it will not continue like that for a very, very long time. And some reviews of the eastern front lines. Unfortunately, Russia retook the territory of Nerlipivka before Ukraine was successful successful the counterattack, taking the central part of the New York City, and here Russians with their attack vector retook the territories. However, at the same time they also had losses, but what are those losses for Russians after all? Yeah, we may say that they use the mid-wave tactics, but it brings sometimes profit to Russia. Not sometimes, but as usual. They just need to pour more people into their army, and Putin knows that. That's why he signed the order to increase the Russian army by 180,000 soldiers from the 1st of December. Now, they definitely have the manpower shortage for those kind of the strikes, but still they may announce a new mobilization. They also may call their reserves the people who served already in the Russian army, and since the service in the Russian army is compulsory for most of the Russian men, we may say that after all that resource for Russia in this particular war against Ukraine is infinite. If Russia had the war with China, for example, yes, it would be difficult for them, but with Ukraine has much less population. For the last 24 hours, Russia also moved in Vodene. They lost their tanks, but they also caused losses for Ukraine. In Toretsk, Ukraine tries to counterattack, but here Russia has more reinforcements. Recently, Russians went into the central part of the city already. Ukraine used some of the artillery against the Russian forces, but still the fighting is ongoing in those quarters. At the same time, there are some of the good news from the Bakhmut direction. There, Ukraine performed a small counterattack, taking more ground. It happened near Pervila village, and Ukraine took those 3 lines under control. Before Russia moved towards that place around 10 days ago, but they haven't enough resources to hold this place. Also, the good thing that for the last 24 hours, Russians haven't moved in Pokrovsk direction. I wouldn't say that the front lines here are stabilized. Russia just looks for the weak spots in Ukrainian defense. But at the same time, Russia moved towards Austria, so it was yesterday, and unfortunately it is today. Russia occupied this vast territory. It happened because Ukraine has withdrawn the forces, so for sure Russia will go further, and Ukraine will move soldiers out from this place as well. It's just imminent. Otherwise, Russians might try to encircle Ukrainian group. For them, it will not be an easy walk because here's the higher ground compared to the positions they take, for example, here. Nevertheless, it's the huge threat for Ukraine, so Ukraine will withdraw the forces to the higher ground. The press officer of the Russian Foreign Ministry, Zakharova, stated that Russia will not take part in Zelensky Peace Formula Conference. Just to remind you, the first part of this conference happened in Switzerland this year, but the second part will not be in Switzerland. It may happen maybe even in India. At least the Ukrainian delegation stated about this probability. And for me it was obvious that Russia will not take part in the conference. They have absolutely different so-called peace plan, which in fact means the capitulation of Ukraine because they want to force Ukraine to give up its territories and after it strike Kiev once again. I mean all of the Ukraine by saying Kiev. The aim for Russia is not Donbass, which is destroyed, and not Crimea, which is occupied and requires lots of the funds from the Russian Federation. Russia wants to occupy Ukraine to seize its existence. And in the larger format, Russia wants to restore the Soviet Union by occupying also Central Asian republics and the Baltic countries, including the countries of NATO. Just imagine what could happen if Russia occupies Ukraine. It will show the example that resisting against Russia will not help if Russia decides to make it a long-term conflict. So now we see that definitely Ukraine starts to obtain less and less munition. If you check out the Western political life, we went from clapping for the courage of Ukraine to the questions why should we finance Ukraine or give weaponry to Ukraine, and those narratives actually were spread by the Russian propaganda. The Russian regime is willing to invest millions into that. So how it happens? They brainwash people like some sort of the group, let's say people who usually not okay with the current government they have, and they say that all of that is because your tax money is going to Ukraine, not into your country projects. But after all, it all matters. I mean, the world matters. I'm 100% sure that if Ukraine loses, it will influence the United States economy dramatically, because the other dictator regimes, like for example in China, they'll say that the United States is just weak and they may try to take Taiwan, and in its turn it will lead to the new war, new chaos. So yes, it's better to support Ukraine, because Russia doesn't want to stop this war. The last night Russians hit the multi-story residential buildings, yes, civilian buildings in Kharkiv with their gliding aviation bombs. The gliding aviation bombs are really precise, especially with the new Russian modifications. So here we are not speaking about some sort of the accidental drop. No, Russians intentionally hit the Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. That's why I honestly hate the Russian military pilots. According to the recent Russian polls, more and more Russians are against this stupid war which Russia started in Ukraine. Around 50% of Russians will be okay if Russia would just withdraw their forces from Ukraine without reaching the Russian or Putin's goal. But still, it's not the critical mass, and the Russian regime simply doesn't care, because the rest of 50% are brainwashed by the Russian TV, and Ukraine does everything to convince Russians that for Russia this war is not profitable at all. Unfortunately for Russians, the only way to do it is to move that war on the territory of the Russian Federation. Without it, there will be no understanding that it's a real war. Russians call it a special military operations, and for most of them, it's ongoing just on TV. It doesn't touch them. But why the rest of 50% of Russians are against this war? Well, basically because of this huge number, and Russia continued to lose their soldiers. So complete loss plus wounded sometimes may reach 1,500 soldiers per day. This number is crazy. So there are many of Russians whose relatives or friends are disabled or gone because of this stupid Putin's war. And unfortunately, this is the only variant of explanation why this war is not profitable at all for Russia. Later on, we're gonna review more news. For now, my friends, don't forget to press your huge like to this video. By doing so, you help me a lot. And as usual, I wish you all a peaceful sky wherever you are, and have a great time.